Arizonans are also voting on two statewide propositions. In short, Prop 207 legalizes recreational marijuana, and Prop 208 imposes a tax on high earners to fund educators. For analysis on both, I'm joined by Arizona Public Media's Alisa Reznick and Jake Steinberg, who have covered the propositions on NPR 89.1. My thanks to both of you for being here. Now let's begin with Prop 207, which you focused on, Alisa. So remind our viewers how it would change the state's laws when it comes to marijuana.
Yeah, Lorraine, so the new proposition, Prop 207, or the Smart and Safe Act, would decriminalize recreational use and allow for recreational sale here in Arizona. Now, medical marijuana has been legal in the state since 2010. There are more than 250,000 medical marijuana card holders here in the state. So proponents of this bill argue that the marijuana industry is already here. So this would be about decriminalizing recreational use and allowing for the state to benefit from that revenue coming from recreational sale. This is the second time the state has tried to pass the bill. A similar measure failed narrowly in 2016.
So given that this proposition had already come before voters, they're having to tailor their message differently. There's also not the same funding sources for or against. How is the campaign different this year?
Well, this year the campaign also focused on a criminal justice aspect of drug policy. It does have an expungement clause, which would allow people who were previously convicted of marijuana-related felonies to apply for expungement.
The polling shows this is a very close race when it comes to this proposition. Are the opponents having any success getting their message across?
The opponents are the same opponents as were present in 2016. They argue that there is a public safety aspect to this bill as well, and that there is they do point to the amount of money coming from the marijuana industry as being sort of a red flag in the sense that this is not necessarily coming from Arizona voters.
Recreational marijuana use, though, would still be a federal crime. So if this comes to fruition and if it passes, how do law enforcement agencies manage this if it's legal in the state but illegally when it comes to the federal government?
Yeah, that will be a difficult question. Proponents argue that these laws have had time, since the first states, Colorado and Washington State, legalized in 2012. They argue that, states like Arizona have had time to really refine these bills specific to how federal law enforcement deals with it versus state law enforcement. There are still a lot of questions, as you mentioned. And, for example, Sahuarita just passed an ordinance that would ban recreational stores in the city itself. And so, local law enforcement and local governments do still have a little bit of that power to kind of decide, even if this bill does pass in the state of Arizona, what that'll actually look like in their cities.
All right. Thank you, Alisa. Let's move on now to Prop 208. Jake, proponents of this measure tried to get it on the ballot in 2018, but it failed. So tell us what happened and how they managed to succeed this time around so voters will be able to decide on this.
Sure. So to get a measure on the ballot, you need to get a certain number of signatures on your petition. And Arizona law says that petition needs to have a 100-word maximum description of the measure and what it would do. It doesn't have to have everything it would do, but it's got to have sort of the key provisions there. And that's kind of what sunk the 2018 measure. The Arizona Supreme Court ruled that the measure on the language on the measure's petition was misleading because it said that there would be a percent increase and not a percentage point increase. It's a technicality, but it was enough to get it struck from the ballot. So this year's measure is nearly identical, and it almost was struck from the ballot for the same reason. A Maricopa County Superior Court judge had the same ruling that the language was misleading, but this time actually the Arizona Supreme Court ruled the opposite way. They said, no, it's fine. Voters can decide on this.
Now, this has been referred to as a tax on the wealthy, but what is the income threshold, and then how much money would it actually generate?
Sure. So, like I said, it's pretty much identical to the measure that was put forward in 2018. It would be a 3.5 percentage point increase on high earners. So that's income over $250,000 for an individual filer and income over $500,000 for a married couple or someone filing as head of household. And so the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, which reviews every ballot measure, has found that the measure would raise $827 million in its first year, which is about 13% of what the state spent on education this year. And that figure is less than some of the supporters have said. They're throwing around figures like $1 billion, but it's actually more than what some opponents of the measure say it would raise.
One of the criticisms has been is that this would negatively affect small businesses. So what's the argument there?
Yeah, absolutely. So some small businesses, I should say, file income under those individual rates, pass-through income, they call it. You know, the argument goes that you are raising taxes here on small businesses even higher than the corporate tax rate. Arizona's corporate tax rate is about 4.9%. The rate would for higher earners would raise from 4.5% all the way to 8%. And some business groups argue that this is going to really negatively affect Arizona's economy. One analysis from the Goldwater Institute, a sort of libertarian think tank here in Arizona, estimated that the measure could result in over 100,000 jobs lost over the next decade due to the costs from small businesses going to their employees.
Now, if this passes, then it would become law, but there has to be some stipulations about how it's written into the state tax code. So what does this tell us about how the funds can actually be spent should it pass?
The language of this measure says that half of the money raised would go to schools as grants for hiring teachers and increasing teacher salaries. And then another quarter would go to schools, again, as grants to hire and increase pay for what they call student support personnel. So that's counselors and bus drivers, cafeteria workers, etc. And then the rest would go to funds for teacher training and retention programs.
All right. My thanks to both of you for your reporting. We look forward to more on this as the election draws much closer here in the days ahead. And on election night, Alisa and Jake will track the results on Props 207 and 208. You can listen for updates on NPR 89.1 and follow their coverage on azpm.org.